Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our Big Book 12-Step telephone workshop. Today is August 7th here in Los Angeles. The call is being recorded. Please join me in a prayer for intervention. Intervention to open our minds and our hearts so that we have some new information and the possibility of a new experience. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. We've been taking a look at step 1. For several months, actually. Trying to get a sense of, an understanding of the first step. It has 2 parts as I see it. The part before the dash and the part after the dash. The part before the dash is about addiction. And it's very different for each individual, certainly for each fellowship. But Bill has a line in his preface to the very first edition in which he says our way of living may have its advantages for all. He doesn't mean all alcoholics. He doesn't just mean all addicts. What he means is, I believe, this is my interpretation, all human beings. We looked at our addiction, different in our body, different in our mind. When we start, we cannot stop. When we stop, we cannot stay stopped. Dash that our life had become unmanageable. There's where the rubber really meets the road in this journey, which is a journey of our human spirit or our spiritual humanity. Either way you want to take a look at it. You've heard the question asked, I'm sure, in writing or in your meetings. Are we human beings seeking a spiritual experience, or are we spiritual beings seeking a human experience? After several weeks of daily meditation, I got an answer. Are we human beings seeking a spiritual experience, or are we spiritual beings seeking a human experience? And the answer is yes. Yes, that's exactly right. And we can't separate it. At least that's my understanding of the nature of my humanity, and it's my understanding of the way the Big Book is structured and written. Bill says unmanageability is the problem. Selfishness, self-centeredness is the heart of unmanageability, and he calls it a spiritual malady. And he says we're powerless. On page 43, he says we're powerless over our addiction, the first half of the first step. There will come a time when we'll have no mental defense against the first drink. And then as we looked at unmanageability as behaviorally demonstrated by the bedevilments on page 52, he summarizes it on page 62. And we can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. I mean, hopeless, doomed, helpless. Not only with regard to our addiction. That's been clear from the suffering that we've endured, despite all of our efforts and all of our commitment to 12-step recovery. But the real challenge is the daily suffering that comes from our humanity, our selfishness and self-centeredness. My will is free. 100%, that's what makes me human. But in so many ways, it's not free. It's not free to choose addiction, and it's not free to choose myself. That's the lesson and the experience of step one. Well, at least this is my interpretation of the big book. My free will is only free in one area. Not addiction and not self, but God or no God. Power or no power. Chapter 4 leads us into this. Bill gave us this kind of context on page 44. And he says on page 45, lack of power is our dilemma. And we have to find a power by which we could live, he says, not by which we manage our addiction, by which we could live. Unmanageability, the spiritual malady. And he says that's what this book is about. It's precisely a textbook. And the first decision that we're invited to make is on page 47. We looked at it last week. The second of the second step decisions. The first one, question rather, the first question that was asked is on page 45. Where and how are we going to find this power? Yeah, okay, that's right. I am powerless, I am hopeless. I am totally ineffective on my own power. That's not academic. That's my history. That's my life. That's my experience. Where and how are we going to find this power? And on page 47, he says, are you willing to believe that even a power exists? Not do you believe? Well, he does say that, but he gives us a fallback position, because the chapter is addressed to the agnostic and the atheist. The people who doubt, or the people who absolutely resist. Agnosis, coming from the Greek knowledge, no knowledge, doubt. Atheist, coming from the Greek theos, atheos, no God. Not a problem, Bill says in the big book, 50% of us are that way. But are you willing to believe? He says, if you can answer that fallback question, I don't believe, but I am willing to believe, then he says you've established with that willingness a cornerstone. He begins to introduce an architectural analogy now that he'll carry through step 5. Here in step 2, he says it's the cornerstone upon which we will build this spiritual arch. Obviously, the assumption is that the first step was the foundation, and the cornerstone is the first stone put on the foundation that sets the direction of the entire spiritual arch. The next time he mentions it is in the third step. We'll get there down the road. But just to complete the metaphor, the picture, he says the third step is the keystone. That is the keystone that holds the entire arch together. The keystone right at the top of the arch that holds the entire spiritual structure together. And then the last time he actually, the next and last time that he mentions the spiritual arch is on page 75, as he concludes his instructions on step 5. Now we've built the spiritual arch, which we have walked to a new freedom. Interesting. He doesn't mention the building blocks. I assume, because of the knowledge I have and the experience I have with the big book in step 4, that the component parts of step 4 are those building blocks, which he asks us to meditate on at the end of the 5th step, page 75. Are the stones in place? Is the cement, the mortar, etc., etc.? We'll get there when we talk about step 5. But the key here now is, and we are, to get focused, we are on step 2. And you were asked to ask yourself a question. What do I believe? I recommended that you look up the word believe in a dictionary. You probably have an understanding and an intuition as to what it means. I looked up faith, I looked up belief, I looked up trust. The dictionary's definition was very unsatisfactory. Faith is belief, belief is trust, trust is faith. And I went in a circular, and it didn't help me. By the time we're through with our exploration of step 2, I believe you'll have a very clear approach, a very clear formula, a very clear path in the definition of faith and belief and trust, and to understand what step 2 is. It's not as clear in the big book, I think, as I'm about to make it. The step says, came to believe. That certainly is my experience, a process like the dimmer switch, a light switch. It wasn't that I read something, understood the formula, and then go, oh, yeah. No, that wasn't it at all. I did the steps in 1988 with a man who changed my life, and this workshop is based on that primary work. But I had no new experience with steps 2 or 3. I did the work again in 1991 with a man who was a mechanic with the steps, and I had a powerful experience with step 1 and step 4, but no new experience with steps 2 and 3. Until I did the work the third time, 1994, with the man who gave me the set-aside prayer that we prayed at the beginning of each of our workshops, and that I suggest that you pray at the beginning of each of your days and anytime you sit down to do the work. Because it was instrumental in my having a new experience with steps 2 and 3, and with the overall steps themselves. And for the very first time, he introduced me to the unmanageability, the nature of the spiritual malady, which I think was really critical to be the platform to even really so desperately desire to challenge my concept of God or power or spirit. And so he gave me that question, what do I believe? As I gave it to you and you wrote out something about what you believe. And of course, the next, well, not of course, but the next question that he gave me, and you may have seen that in the next assignment, is, how do you behave in light of what you believe you believe? There was a week in between. I wrote out how I believed. I came and I read it to him. He sent me home and gave me that second question, how do you behave? And I went and I began to write. How do I behave in light of what I wrote that I believe? It was embarrassing. It was shocking. Because I didn't behave as I wrote I believed. I wasn't a daily meditator. I didn't rely on a power other than myself. I believed academically that there was this God of the heavens, but it didn't seem to be relevant to my life, despite 10 years of being sober and having had 2 previous spiritual awakenings. By that I mean not any sense of the presence of God. What I mean is a change in my behavior that I couldn't have done, didn't have done to me, by me, before this process. A change that seemed to be alchemic. 1 and 1 made 5. Normal math, 1 and 1 makes 2. Spiritual math, 1 and 1 makes 5. My willingness and action is important, but grace, I had never accounted for it. That X plus factor that takes us over the goal line. I cannot get there on my own. And I didn't know that I didn't know that. And I began to suspect it when I asked that second question and I wrote out the answer. How do I behave? It's assignment 7. If you've paid attention to assignments 6, 7, and 8, there's a progressive reading of chapter 4 that's indicated. Assignment 6 says read chapter 4 with a highlighter and kind of surface anything that you respond to, resonate with. Assignment 7 says read it again, but with a different perspective. Read it from the negative. Read it from the position, the perspective of doubt. Is there any word, is there any phrase that you intuitively resist or doubt or have a negative resonance with? And then this final assignment 8, to reread chapter 4 with the different color highlighter. So this is the 3rd color highlighter. Mechanically, it's probably a contrivance, but it was powerful for me. I found myself highlighting over other highlights with different colors, only because I looked at it in a different way with the set-aside prayer and then a little different shift in the question and a whole lot of shift in my consciousness. And the final assignment, number 8, suggests that we read it from a positive standpoint. What do we absolutely agree with in terms of the words and the phrases? Especially looking at picking out the synonyms for power, higher power, for God, for spirit. And I made comment that any word in the middle of a sentence with a capital at the beginning of the word is usually a signal that it's a synonym for higher power. Not all the time. There may be a couple exemptions where you would be challenged to ask yourself, really? Does Bill initial capitalize reason with a capital R, meaning reason's a God really? Or is it tongue-in-cheek? That reason we've made a God, which has not been very effective. My interpretation, it's not in the big book, it's not in the 12 and 12, it's not in clarifying material. I try to understand what was Bill's intent. What was he writing? What was he thinking? What did he want us to understand? What did he want us to know? What did he want us to experience? And I challenged that one reason as a tongue-in-cheek. Most human beings make reason God. And it's wonderful, our ability to reason, to know that we know. But it's got its own deficiencies, as we know. We left off taking a look at the cornerstone, page 47 in the big book. And on page 47, he says, your own conception of God is what we mean here. Not the books, not your 12-step fellowships, not your sponsor, not your religious tradition. No other outside reference point, please. Use that set-aside attitude in prayer. He says, do not let any prejudice you may have, meaning prior learning, prior indication, prior perspective, deter you from honestly asking, what do they mean to you? This was all you needed to commence to get spiritual growth, he said, to effect your very first conscious relation with God as we understand God. There's a whole part of me that wants the big book to be rewritten just in this one area, God as we don't understand it. Because he is very clear. Any word, any thought, any definition that we have is inherently wrong. It's inadequate. We're talking about a reality that we're speculating is, and if it is, it's infinite. But we're doing the speculation from our finite minds and our finite experience. It would be like trying to pour the ocean into a bucket. The bucket's not adequate. My mind, my understanding, my ability to comprehend is not adequate because it's finite. It cannot hold the truth of the reality, capital R. That's what they call faith. You see, that's a decision about a reality for which there is no evidence or comprehension or understanding. He says, afterwards, we find ourselves accepting many things that seemed out of reach. So he says at the end of that paragraph, we use our own conception, however limited it is. Gandhi said, and it's my experience, my concept of God will change as I do. My concept has changed. Originally, the traditional concept from my religious training and background. In 1988, I chose father and child just because I had other reasons for that, not relevant right now. In 1991, I chose mentor teacher. There's a different relationship and a different terminology. It was done more academically than it was existentially with any particular meaning. And yet when I look back over it, it had a particular meaning because it's what I needed at the time. That attribute, that quality is exactly what I needed. And I did it intuitively, not with any instruction from the big book or from my step guide or sponsor. That's the benefit of being guided by the Spirit. And then in 1994, when I had the set-aside prayer and the experience with the bedevilments and the experience with these two questions that were veil-rending, I realized that my concept of God, my concept of power, my concept of spirit was the very impediment to my relationship with the mystery. The ideas I had, the experiences I thought I had, were the very impediment, obstacles to my relationship with the reality, with the mystery. Because I thought I knew, and in knowing I control, or had the illusion of. It was a huge breakthrough. I found that I was a doubter. I was an agnostic, not a theoretical agnostic, but a practical one. I doubted the power of God because I doubted the relevancy of God as I looked at my behavior. As I've mentioned many times, my head has a tendency to rationalize and to lie to me. And I don't know that I don't know. But my feet never do. That's why that question, how do you behave, is so critical. It tells us exactly what we believe. If in fact I'm not meditating, I don't believe I need power. If I'm not meditating, I don't believe there is a power. If I'm not meditating, I don't believe the power is available to me. One of those three. My feet tell me the truth. And so on page 47, he says, are you willing? That's the cornerstone. We commenced at this simple level. And then he takes us through a swagger, really, of science and salesmanship and poetry and logic and mathematics and etc. Pages 48 through page 53. Faced with alcoholic destruction, he says on page 48, we soon became open-minded. That's the benefit of the set-aside prayer and an experience with step one. Whether it's an experience of the body, the allergy and powerlessness, or whether it's an experience of the mind and the obsession and relapse and powerlessness, or whether it's in all good faith, your abstinence is intact, but your life is a serial suffering, unmanageability. But he says it finally beat alcohol. The addiction is a great persuader. It beat us into a state of reasonableness, a tedious process. He gives us some wonderful synonyms on page 49. An all-powerful, guiding, creative intelligence. That's a meditation. Intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation. Perhaps you read Pierre Desjardins, a paleontologist, a Jesuit priest, who talked about the Alpha and the Omega at the turn of the century. But again, he says, we who have traveled this dubious path, meaning the path of doubt, page 49, beg of you to lay aside prejudice. Faith gives us a sense of purpose. But what does he mean by faith? These are questions. Each of us need to settle for ourselves, he says on page 50. He talks about the emotion. But he gives us some poetry at the end here. They have come to believe in a power greater than ourselves, to take a certain attitude toward that power, step 3. And to do certain simple things, steps 4 through 9. There has been a revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking, that spiritual math that I talked about earlier. In the face of collapse and despair, in the face of total failure of their human resources, again, recapping step 1, they found that a new power, peace, and happiness and a sense of direction flowed into them. That's my new word for the spirit, flow, capital F. I'm in the flow. I'm in life's flow. This happened soon after they wholeheartedly met a few simple requirements. Leaving aside the drink problem. You see on page 51, it's not about the addiction. Oh, it is until it's not. But he says, leaving aside the drink problem. They tell us why living is so unsatisfactory, those unmanageabilities. The consciousness of the presence of God is today the most important fact of their lives. The consciousness, that is a relationship with, a decision to have. He takes us through the bedevilments as we've already taken a look at as part of step 1. And at the bottom of that page, he talks about the spirit of the universe. Our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. See, not our idea of God. Our idea of God is not God, but the reality behind the word or the idea. A reality that we can't get to, but we want desperately to believe that it is available. On page 53, he brings us home. This is the third of the step 2 questions. Crushed by a self-imposed crisis, step 1. We could not postpone or evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else God is nothing. God either is or isn't. What's our choice? There's the heart of step 2. He doesn't tell us in the step itself, or even in the instructions that I've just summarized, that step 2 is a decision. But he's led us up to, from his instructions, to that conclusion. Page 47, do you believe or are you willing to believe? What is that? A decision. On page 53, he says, God is or God isn't. What is your choice? There's no fallback position. It's black and white. Is there a power, other than yourself that is available to you, that you can have a relationship with, that cares enough to, in fact, intervene. Those are the implications here. And it's not because you know it, and it's not because you have any certitude about it. It's not because you feel it or have any emotion about it. Thoughts and feelings are irrelevant. My body and my mind are irrelevant. But my will, the source of my spiritual malady, is in fact the most relevant here with regard to the choice. I choose. God is. Nothing happened. No knowledge, no certitude, no feeling, no experience, no special emotion. That's faith now. Faith is that decision that God is. Oh, my mind says that's reasonable. You see, he says on page 53 in the next paragraph, arrived at this point, we were squarely confronted with the question of faith, just like we are doing. We couldn't duck the issue. Some of us have already walked far over the bridge of reason. See, capital B, capital R, tongue-in-cheek perhaps. False God. Toward the desired shore of faith, the outlines and the promise of the new land. Capital N, capital L. That sounds like it's a synonym. The new land across the bridge. The decision and the leap of faith. The existentialists, a philosophical movement around the 19th century, called this the leap of faith across the chasm. Like Indiana Jones, looking at the chasm that he had to cross, and with all whatever intuition, he put his foot out, and the bridge appeared. Friendly hands had stretched out in welcome. We were grateful that reason, again, tongue-in-cheek, had brought us so far, but somehow we couldn't quite step ashore. Perhaps we had been leaning too heavily on reason that last mile, and we didn't like to lose our support. Faith is the decision that God is. My mind then says, I engage my mind. That's a big part of who I am as a human being. My mind says, well, I've had an experience in step one of not enough power. Therefore, to make a decision that there is a power that could intervene, it's a reasonable decision. I'm going to accept it. That's my belief. Faith is the decision. My acceptance of the decision by my rational being, my rational mind, that's my belief. And then it puts my body into action, and that's trust. I make a decision, I accept the decision, and I take the actions as if the decision I made is based on fact and reality. And I don't have any certitude, and I don't have any feeling, but I'm going to behave that way anyway. Faith is the decision. Acceptance is my belief. And trust is putting it all into action. So, next week we will conclude step 2, chapter 4, beginning with page 53, answering the questions that were posed on page 45. Where and how are we going to find that power? Bill Waite's 10 pages. That answer's on page 55. So do the best you can to review and complete assignment 8. And the final question on assignment 8 is, what do you need? What attributes and qualities do you need God to be and have? At this point, not academically, experientially, based on your connection to and experience with step 1. What word or phrase captures your concept? Not the books, not your sponsors, not Herb's. The words that come to you after praying that set-aside prayer, after doing these assignments 6, 7, and 8. You're making a decision. God is or God isn't. And the invitation here in this time between now and next week is, God is what? God is who? What are the attributes and qualities that you need this power to have? The assignment is to complete step 2 with assignment number 8. To the best of your ability, don't hurt yourself. This is an organic process. And let's close with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.